How's it going, class? My name's Paul. I'm really excited to talk about this section of the chapter that I read. I thought that it was very challenging and it really made me think a lot. And so I went ahead and picked the section on John Yoder. It was very intriguing and really challenged my views on everything. And so I'm excited to talk about this. When Richard Hayes talks about John Yoder, I like that he titles it "Following the Way of Jesus," because Yoder is literally just looking at Jesus' life and goes on to show how that should affect how we read the Bible, how we live our lives, and it really, really challenged me. And so John Yoder, he was an American theologian. He lived from 1927 to 1997. He was best known for a book titled "The Politics of Jesus." Um, and it had three main ideas, Hayes points out. Number one is the New Testament bears witness to Jesus' renunciation of violence and coercive power. And so um, Yoder thinks that Jesus was a pacifist, and so he talks about that a lot. He talks about that Jesus' example is directly relevant and normatively binding for the Christian community. And so basically, okay, if Jesus set an example for us, then we should definitely follow it. And the last thing is that the faithfulness to Jesus is a political choice, not a withdrawal from the realm of politics, which I found really, really interesting, especially in this time that we're living in right now. And so one of the important things to know when I was reading about Yoder is that he looks to Jesus' example, not necessarily his sayings or isolated passages of the Bible. He just looked at his life overall. And I thought this was really cool because one quote that Hayes says is that from Yoder is, if Jesus is not a model for conduct, the theological significance of his humanity may be diminished. And so if we're not following Jesus' conduct, then what are we really following? And I thought this was interesting because Yoder doesn't even discuss in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus says turn the other cheek, which you would expect any pacifist to discuss. But I thought it was interesting that Hayes says that he doesn't worry about it because he's just looking at Jesus' overall life. He doesn't even really talk about that one specific teaching, which I thought was kind of strange, kind of interesting. But when discussing Jesus' pacifism, one of the things that Yoder points out is Jesus' temptation in the garden. I thought this was interesting. He calls it a political temptation, which I had never really thought of it like that. But he says that Jesus was tempted with three things: to either retract his statements so that he wouldn't be in trouble, to use his messianic power to have violence against the authorities and win them over, or he could accept his suffering and die on the cross. And so Yoder says, hey, Jesus had this option to be violent and to fight back against the government that was trying to oppress him and make him suffer and kill him. And Jesus gave into this, and he died on the cross. And so by refusing violence, Jesus brought God's kingdom on earth. And so I think this fascinated Yoder and drove Yoder to read the New Testament through the cross. And everything he read. And so he didn't isolate passages. He didn't focus on little parts. He saw everything through the cross, and he saw Jesus' whole life as a life of peace, and that this peace ultimately led to good. So he likes peace rather than violence. He likes being a servant rather than seeking dominion. And he sees Christ's example showing all of these things. I thought it was really interesting. Another quote from Yoder is that the calling of the church is to be the conscious and the servant within human society. And so Yoder saw the community of the church as needing to follow Jesus, and that if we're doing this, we're going to have a conscience that leads us to be seeking peace rather than violence. I thought that this was really interesting because, to be honest, whenever I think about ethics and violence and peace, I think a lot of times I lean towards self-defense a lot just because rationally it makes sense. And so I always think of the example, if someone's going to attack my wife or my country, then of course we should defend ourselves. Or if someone's going to attack my family, my friends, like myself, I think I should defend myself. But I think Yoder really challenges that. He even says that if you're going off of what's rational or what you're thinking, and if someone who doesn't know Christ can have your same ethic, then you have a problem. And so if it's rational for everyone in the world to defend themselves, that's not necessarily Christian thinking. But if we're truly to be Christians and to be led by the Spirit, then we're following Christ's very extreme example of pacifism. And that only because we know Christ can pacifism make sense. And so I thought this was really interesting.